Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the house of the Lord. It's so good to see you all here this morning. Let me ask you, if you would, please stand out of reverence to the Word of God, and let's repeat together our theme verse for the year. So then, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but are fellow citizens of the saints and members of God's household. Ephesians 2:19. Thank you so much. You may be seated. We're continuing in our series of messages from the book of Ephesians. God's plan is family. We've been, over the past few weeks, looking at a household code. That's the way I describe these. There are several of them in the New Testament, and these are moments where we're given instruction for different groups of people and relationships that occur within a household. We've, over the past couple of weeks, looked at the first two groupings, and today we'll look at the third grouping. We talked about husbands and wives, we talked about parents and children, and today we will be talking about slaves and lords. And a common attack on the Christian faith is its apparent complicity with the slave industry. If we look at the instruction we're about to look at today, slaves are told to obey their lords. And that really is counter to our current sentiments about things, right? The Bible doesn't tell slaves to rebel against their lords, but to obey them. And so I can see how people might read that and think, wow, that's not a politically correct thing to say. But I would ask, are we understanding the intent of these instructions correctly? And let me begin by throwing a thought out there. I'd like you to start chewing on this. Don't you find it odd that the first nations in the world that have abolished slavery are the nations most influenced by the Christian faith? If the Christian faith is complicit in this, how do you explain that? So let's read what Paul is actually saying to slaves and their lords. And I have titled today's message, How Christ is Changing the World. We're in Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verses 5 through 9. Let's begin in verse 5. Slaves, obey your lords according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ. And before we kind of jump into this, we probably need to know a little bit about what slavery Paul is addressing, what it was like in the first century. Now, slavery was a dominant feature of the Roman world. And under the Roman Empire, in Paul's day, a third or more of the population would have been made up of slaves. That means that if you had a house church of 45, 15 to maybe even as much as 20 of them would have been slaves. That's a lot of people. And you might wonder how the society functioned. And I've pointed things like this out before. Slavery in the first century was a little bit different than the slavery we experienced most recently in our nation. Probably the most obvious difference was that slavery in the first century was not limited to a particular ethnicity. Slavery in our nation was pretty much people from Africa. And so if you were of that race, it was assumed you would be a slave, or it was very highly likely you would be a slave. And if you were not, then people didn't even consider it a possibility, pretty much. Well, in antiquity, in Paul's day, race had nothing to do with it. So the owner and the slave would most often be the same ethnicity, the same race. So it was a purely cultural, so some translators try to distinguish things, because for many slaves in the Roman world, the experience of slavery was not as oppressive as what we know in our most recent history. Slaves lived in the household, not in some other quarters outside working fields while the owners lived in this mansion, but they were actually part of the household, and many of them would be in positions of responsibility within the household. Think more of a butler or somebody who basically keeps the whole household running and administers things and is buying things and has considerable power and responsibility. Some would be really well educated. They would be slaves who had been hired to tutor the children of the owners of the household, and they would be very well versed and really well prepared people. So for some people, being a slave wasn't really as bad as we might think, but and because of that, a lot of translations today try to use a different word. They say bond servants. And here's what would happen in antiquity. If you were desperately poor and you were struggling to find food to eat, you would just sell yourself into slavery, because at least that way you would have a roof over your head and you would have food to eat. You would be guaranteed. And a lot of people would do that. They would survive by selling themselves as slaves. So some translators go with bond servants as their translation for this word. But that really doesn't cover everything, because that wasn't the only kind of slave. The Romans were constantly fighting other nations. They would conquer a nation, and then they would take captive a whole bunch of the population, the people they thought would be most trouble to them. They would bring them back to Rome or to whatever big city, and they would sell them on auction. And that's how a lot of people ended up as slaves. They were conquered people who had been purchased and sold. And the truth is, what Paul describes here, the word doulos, slave, means that somebody who is the property of another person. And that's very much the way it was in the first century, the way it was in our recent history here. And with that kind of power come inevitable abuses. When you have that kind of power over another human being, there are a lot of abuses. So you might expect Paul to say something about that. In fact, when we read these passages, oftentimes what we care about, the question we come to the passage with, okay, we're going to talk about slaves and lords. Here's the only question I have. Should that even be a thing? Should there even be slavery? Isn't it morally abhorrent as a practice? Shouldn't we just condemn it soundly and that's the end of the conversation? And what I want you to ponder a minute is, if more than a third of your population is slaves, what kind of economic and social powers are tied into this whole thing? And how do you change something like that? Now, here's the surprising thing. As entrenched as it was in Paul's day, as impossible to change as it might have seemed in Paul's day, 2,000 years later, it's gone. God changed it. How did he accomplish that with the kind of instructions we're reading here? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. But ponder this, that slavery was the basic, the whole financial structure of the Roman Empire depended on this. It was deeply meshed into the culture. So Paul's instructions are, let's dismantle the whole culture. He's like, let's let Christ change the culture. How do we go about that? So it's very interesting to me that Paul uses sacred language to address all of this. He chooses to describe their masters as lords. He uses the same word he uses to talk about Jesus, kurios. You're kurioi, you have these lords over you. But he does make a quick distinction, according to the flesh. And that's Paul's shorthand for if we take God out of the equation. When Paul talks about walking in the Spirit or walking in the flesh, he's not talking about two potentialities in the human soul, that we are spiritual beings on the one hand, but we are physical beings on the other, so we can kind of lean into the spiritual side of life or lean into the physical side of life. That's not the way Paul uses these terms. I would say when Paul is talking about in the Spirit, you need to capitalize Spirit. He's not talking about us. He's talking about God. And what he's saying in the Spirit is when you're operating in subjection to God Almighty and under His supervision and guidance, and God is the one managing things, that's in the Spirit. In the flesh is we're going to put God off to the side and we're going to do it our way. We're going to accomplish things in our own efforts and our own capabilities. And that includes everything we bring to the table, spiritual, mental, physical. Everything a human being brings to the table is what Paul means by in the flesh. So he's saying, when I use this term lords, I'm not saying these are God. I'm saying this is what the world has established as lords. This is what we humans have come up with and what we have put into the world. And already we can tell Paul is making a clear distinction. Yes, slaves and lords are a reality in culture, but that's not something that came from God. That's something we humans did. So already he's making it very clear. This isn't God's will. In fact, Paul does address the issue of, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 17, he's talking to slaves, and he tells slaves, this is his advice, if you have the option to buy yourself out of slavery, by all means, do it. So Paul isn't saying slavery is something you should seek, something you should try to get into. And in fact, if you can get out of it because it will open up more things that you are able to do, more freedom to do things. But he says, slaves, obey your lords. You might think, well, if this is a human invention, it's not what God wanted, why should I obey them? And the fact that Paul uses the same word, obey your lords, the same word he uses to say, obey your Lord Christ. And notice he continues with this sacred language, with fear and trembling. The kind of reverent awe. That's the language we use to describe the way we should react to God, right? We should approach God with fear and trembling, with a sense of awe. Paul's very deliberate. He's using sacred language to describe this ugly human invention, this relationship that's happening on earth that God didn't design. And what Paul is, maybe we can begin to understand what Paul is thinking here. What if we step into these dark spaces and think of them not as this prison, but as this particular dark sphere in which the light of Christ needs to shine? And what if God put me in this dark corner of the world because He wanted His light to be shown in this dark corner of the world through me? So Paul says, think of your relationship with your Lord and the way you are doing your life as your relationship with Christ. And He's done this consistently. He tells wives to fear their husbands. And He doesn't mean be afraid of them. He means use that same reverent choice to honor as you do with Christ. That's the consistent teaching of Paul in all of this. So slaves, obey your lords with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ. So yeah, I'm using this sacred language because I want you to think of your service to this Lord as your service to Christ. I want you to think of what you are doing in life as the sphere within which God is calling you to live a life of devotion and worship to Him. So that what you are doing as you obey your Lord is you are worshiping Christ. You are honoring Christ. Not as service to be seen, as people pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing God's will from the soul. Now, some might have said, okay, yeah, Paul, that's good advice. If I have this attitude of reverence to my Lord and I'm obedient, then he's going to take note of that. And he's going to look at me and say, boy, this is my best slave. I probably should put him in charge of everything. And you might think of these instructions as beneficial to yourself, as a way to advance in your career and get better off in life. And surely, if they do what Paul is saying, that is likely going to happen. But Paul says, I'm not telling you to try to better your situation, to try to earn something for yourself. I'm not trying to encourage you to cynically pretend to revere and honor and obey your masters because that will benefit you in some way. He says, I want you to do it sincerely, not as service to be seen. In other words, what Paul's telling them to do is, you're going to do this whether anybody sees it or not. Even in those situations where you know that you are obeying what you were told to do, and you know nobody is ever going to know you obeyed. Those situations where you could say, I'm going to disobey, and you know not a soul would ever find out. Paul says, don't do it as though you're just trying to be observed. We have a big temptation, right, to do things to posture before others, right? Boy, isn't that what social media is all about? Presenting this persona of our glorious selves to the world so that we are the envy of everybody. Paul's describing the exact opposite attitude. Don't do stuff to be seen. Don't worry about raising your brand, your profile. As people pleasers, as trying to keep people happy, get them impressed with you. See, if you're doing that, then you're not worshiping Christ. You are trying to help yourself out. So Paul says, don't do it that way. Do it whether or not anybody ever sees it. And don't be thinking, I'm going to win this person over by doing this. Do it whether or not they ever appreciate it or thank you for it. Because you're not doing it for them. This is your worship to Christ. He says, doing God's will from the soul. I'm probably one of the only people that translates it literally like that. That's a Greek expression that we don't really have in English. We don't do things from our soul, but probably the closest would be do it with all your heart, right? But I thought it was curious, that phrase, it just seems so, it implies such depth in what we're talking about here. Not just some superficial thing, but something that is coming from your very soul. Do this service as you are trying to please God, and you're doing it with all your soul. You're throwing everything you have into this. Willingly giving your slave service as to the Lord and not to humans. So yeah, this is slave service. You're obligated to do it. Do it gladly. Do it willingly. Now, the joy does not come from the human master. It doesn't come from the satisfaction of this other human being the recipient of your reverence and your willingness to obey. You're doing this because the true object of your devotion is Christ. And this is the sphere in which Christ has called you to follow him. So you see your sphere, you see your circumstance as the context within which this life of worship has to take place. And the service that is put before you is your opportunity to honor Christ. So you do it willingly, gladly, not begrudgingly, not complaining, not dragging your feet. But you owe everything to Christ, therefore you want to give everything you have back. Now, slaves had no choice. They had to obey whether they wanted to or not. And if they didn't, their masters had many ways, pretty much limitless ways, to make you do what they wanted you to do. In fact, in Roman culture, if slaves were rebellious or disobedient, it was expected that you would make an example of them so that others would not follow their pattern of behavior, because more than a third of the population was slaves. If they didn't stay in line, the whole thing would fall apart. There was tremendous pressure on masters to keep their slaves in line. So these slaves are living in a tremendously restricted situation. What might Paul know about that? As he writes this letter several years into an unfounded, a falsely accusation-based imprisonment. You think Paul felt restricted in his ability to do ministry, to serve Christ, to honor him? We read his letters that he wrote while in prison. Do you ever hear him gripe about it, complain about it, say, "Oh, I can't do anything for Christ, I'm stuck in prison"? Paul never talks like that. And he's telling slaves, do the same thing. I don't care where you find yourself. You may find yourself at the very bottom in this dark corner of human society. And slavery is what humans have come up with. And you're at the bottom of the whole pile. Paul says, don't think of this as, oh, I have no freedom, I have no liberty. There's nothing I can do to serve Christ. I can't be a missionary like Paul. I can't do this. I can't do that. Therefore, my life in Christ is pointless. It's meaningless. Paul says, no. Lean into it. Don't just begrudgingly accept it, but throw yourself into it. What Paul is saying is, this is the way God is trying to change the world. He finds the darkest corners of human society, and he places his children in these dark corners and says to them, be like me. Live a life of service, whether they're watching or not. Genuine, devoted service. Treat them with honor as more important than yourself. Place them above yourself willingly. Behave like Christ in that dark corner of the world, because that is a dark corner of the world where there's no other way the light of Christ is going to enter. And you have a unique mission, a unique opportunity that nobody else has. So Paul says, embrace it, do it willingly, because you are not serving humans. You are serving Christ, who is using you to upend the world, to change it. What do you think happens in this world when all of a sudden the slave begins treating his Lord in such a way that it becomes evident that this slave is a better person than the Lord? They're more noble. They're more selfless. They're a better example of virtue and every possible glorious thing you could expect from a human life. What happens to a Lord, an abusive, entitled Lord, when he begins to be served by somebody like that? What happens to his concept of the whole structure of his society? That'll do something that no level of philosophical argumentation will accomplish. Why did slavery fall apart? Because for 2,000 years, Christians followed the instructions Christ gave us. And society finally realized, this is horrible. We can't live this way. You might say, does Paul have warrant to tell us that we can view our serving of others as serving Christ? I'm glad you asked that question. Okay, I did. Yes, Christ explicitly said that. In Matthew 25, he tells this parable of, and he equates it to the Son of Man distinguishing between people. He talks, it's like a shepherd separating out sheep from goats. And he says that he's going to separate them out. And this is the basis upon which the Son of Man separates out people. To the sheep, which he says, come into the kingdom of my Father. The others, he says, get out. You have nothing to do with me. When he says, they ask, he says, come into my kingdom because I was thirsty. You gave me to drink. I was hungry. You fed me. I was in prison and you came to see me. I was sick and you ministered to me. And they say, Lord, I think we would have recognized you. Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, as you did it to a slave, you did it to me. And then to the goats, he says, get out of here. You got nothing to do with me. He says the same thing. What? I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was in prison. You never bothered with me. And they say, wow, we never knew. You needed that kind of help. And his response, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. Very clearly, Paul is not coming up with something new. He is simply repeating what Christ himself taught, that if you want to worship me, you will show your devotion to me in the way you treat the people around you. And if you serve somebody else, you are serving me. So Paul says, slaves, man, you are in a unique position to embrace a glorious service that the world will not have an explanation for. You live in a position where the world has taken everything from you, and yet you choose to give yourself gladly. It's something to, as an act of condescension, be the person in power and authority and do kindness to those beneath you. But if you have nobody beneath you, and you still discover the capacity to serve and honor others willingly, gladly, with devotion. Verse 8, knowing that whatever good each one is doing, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. This is the certain knowledge, Paul says, the slave can have. That everybody, whatever good thing anybody on the face of the earth is doing, he's going to receive back from the Lord. Now, this is a consistent teaching across the Bible. God is just. And God rewards wickedness with punishment, and he rewards goodness with good. And he is absolutely going to repay every sin. And you might say, no, I thought the Christian faith says we don't have to worry about sin. God's not going to punish us. He's not going to do. Well, that's true, but it's only true because Christ stepped in and said, I'll take that punishment. God didn't just pretend. Payment had to be issued in full, and every bit of our sin was paid in full at the cross. And if God repays every sin, he also repays every good. And here's the thing, when you are doing the thing that honors God and you say, nobody's going to ever see it, nobody is going to appreciate it, nobody is going to thank me for it, that's not the reason you're doing it. You're doing it to honor the Christ who gave his life for you. And you know, it doesn't matter what anybody else sees or appreciates or gives a good response to, because your Lord is going to receive, you are going to receive back from your Lord everything. What that reward from God looks like, I don't know. But we are told there's a perfect accounting of every act of obedience, and it receives its repayment from God. And here we see the kernel of the thought that will dismantle slavery, whether he is a slave or free. And Paul right there is saying, there's really no distinction between you and the Lord. Your call to worship Christ in your life is no different than the call Christ is issuing on the Lord of your household. And if he is obedient and honors Christ and throws himself into it, he will receive the response from the Lord that deserves. But the fact that you have so little doesn't mean that your devotion to God means less to God. The faithfulness of a slave is just as important to God as the faithfulness of a king. Consider how that elevates the lowest. We're told that Christ came to raise the low and to bring down the high. Paul is saying, let Christ elevate you, make you glorious. And you do it by pushing into service. Verse 9. And lords, listen closely. And lords, do the same things to them. I want you to ponder a moment. What was it like the first time this letter arrived in Ephesus and they're in the church and you have some lords of the manor sitting there and you have slaves and somebody's reading the letter out loud to the whole church and, the slaves obey your masters, blah, blah, blah. And there was, okay, that sounds good. How do you think people would have reacted when he got to this sentence? And lords, do the same things to them. Them being your slaves. The reason Paul's instructions to the lords are much shorter is because he basically says, see verses X through Y for my instructions. I'm going to tell you to do exactly the same thing. People that complain that Paul is condoning slavery, if you're not going to follow his instructions, don't complain about what he had to say. What will it look like if the Lord of the manor is serving the slaves in his household and honoring them and seeing that as his way of showing his devotion to Christ? It says stopping with the threatening. That's how lords kept order in their households, right? Threats, the whip. Knowing that your Lord and theirs is in the heavens, and there is no partiality with him. Paul makes explicit what he hinted at when he was talking to the slaves. He says, absolutely, God makes no distinctions between any of us. In our societies, we make distinctions. If you're the Lord, you're in charge. If you're a slave, you're property, and you do whatever you're told to do, and that's your lot in life. Paul says, yeah, we do all this kind of stuff. But God doesn't respect our distinctions. He doesn't care. He doesn't care what we say. He is going to honor and respond to each one based on their own willingness to obey him and to honor him. And Paul is calling for absolute reciprocity. The slave obeys and honors and reveres the Lord. And the Lord does the same things toward the slave. He treats the slave with the same level of reverence that he expects to receive. And we might say, that doesn't work. Somebody has to be in charge, right? That's the way we organize things. You put somebody in charge who tells everybody else what to do, and that's how everything works out. You can't let everything just kind of be mutual service. That's our model for governing. That's our model for exercising authority. Let me ask you a question. How does Christ exercise authority? He could have showed up, been born into the palace in Rome, and been born as the Caesar. He could have taken hold the reins of power from the very beginning, and could have issued laws that are just and condemned the wicked and done all the things he could have done. He could have seized control of every area of power and influence in culture, in society, in government, every bit of it, all those famous 7 mountains that people are talking about. But he didn't do it, did he? He raised no armies. He did not curry political power. In fact, every political group in his day, even people who hated each other, joined forces to put him on the cross. How did he defeat sin and death? He did it by dying on a cross. By giving himself up. That's how he crushed sin. That's how he killed death. How does Christ rule his church? Is it through an authoritarian imposition of his will? Or is it by showering us with gifts? And by serving us? Who started this whole thing? I say, I want to honor Christ. I want to serve Christ. Did I start serving Christ first? Or when I was dead in sins and trespasses, did he go to the cross for me? There is a different way for authority to be exercised. And that's what Paul is saying. If you have no authority, great. God has put you in a dark corner of the world, and he wants you to gloriously display his light in that dark corner because it desperately needs it. And if you are in a position of great authority, God has put you there because he wants you to show the world that there's a different way to exercise authority. And it's not about selfish desire and privilege, but about the capacity to serve gloriously and have great resources to serve. The Lord had so much a broader option of ways in which to serve. Paul says, embrace that. You might say, well, this has nothing to do with us. Slavery's been abolished. Why are we even looking at these verses? Well, Paul was addressing a specific cultural structure. He was talking about slaves and the owners of those slaves. But to think that in our society today we have completely eradicated social structural distinctions is absurd. The CEO moves about in this world with a whole other level of power and deference from others than the homeless guy on the street, right? And some of us are in those positions of authority. Some of us are in positions where we are able to influence a lot of people who depend on us and who have to follow our lead. To those of us in these circumstances, Paul is saying, use that as a way to honor Christ. Some of us may think we are powerless. We're nothing. We're just the lowest of the low. We've got no money. We've got no authority. We've got no power. I can't do anything. You need to remember that Christ wants to do just as glorious a thing in your life as he does in anybody else's. When the least of us embrace the glory of our station, when we understand service as the highest expression of our devotion to Christ, and when the greatest among us take off privilege, the power that society gives to them on a platter, when they take up the wash basin and towel and bend down to wash the feet of their servants, the world sees what God is up to. Christ is erasing every barrier. He's drawing us together. And this is the great mystery that Paul's been talking about throughout this whole letter. That God is bringing all things together in Christ. This great mystery, hidden for the ages, finally revealed in Christ, is made tangible in the lives of his children. And this is how the world is changed by Christ and his gospel. Not by us seizing control of things, but by us embracing every corner we inhabit and gloriously serving Christ. We're going to sing a song as we close. And this is our time to respond to God. Whatever he's said to you in this morning, whatever he's laid on your heart, you need to speak back to him and express to him your desire to honor him and to live a life of worship and devotion to him. So we have the altar open. By the altar, I mean these steps at the front of the stage. Get out of your pew, come forward, kneel on these steps and speak to Christ what he needs to hear from your heart this morning. If you want somebody to pray with you, I'll be here to the side. Come and share with me. I'd be delighted to pray for you. Let's all stand. Please come while we sing.